All right, back to American history. All right, somebody tell us where we were. In America, okay, let's narrow it down a little bit. We ran things right up to the Declaration of Independence. Let's review and remind ourselves. I'm sure since we had a test on this is right there in your mind. But just remind ourselves of some things. I feel like me, I don't hardly remember giving the test. It was just a week ago. I don't know why it seems like it's been so long. But these are the things we talked about before the test. We went back, let's go back here real quick, to George III. And he comes into power, and we have Grenville's program, all kinds of different laws he passed to address this burgeoning issue of the colonists and how they're going to pay. Several of his laws stirred up interest. A lot of them stirred up interest. But the Sugar Act was one. That was the one that was a tax purely for revenue. We also saw the Stamp Act was one that stirred up lots of interest. What was especially egregious about the Stamp Act? Matthew?
No jury trial for those convictions.
Okay, no jury trial. All right, we see the big blow up over that, and England backing down. And then the next guy that's given the task here of handling the colonists was Charles Townshend. He lays out really one main law. He does suspend the New York legislature and then runs out the Revenue Act. That was the tax on goods coming into the colonies. He thought the Stamp Act stirred up so much interest because the colonists had to pay it individually. He thought if we just have a tax on the imports, they really won't notice and we'll be fine. So he lays out this Revenue Act. That doesn't go so well. The colonists respond. We ended up with the Boston Massacre as part of that response. And again, England backing down. They do leave a tax on the tea as symbolic claims to the right to do this, but they back off the other things. Then we have this little bit of a lull, and we get to the tea tax of 1773 that we mentioned on the test. That was the tax that allowed them to ship the tea directly to the colonists rather than having to go to England and back across. Went straight to the colonists, but it was still taxed. It was cheaper than the previous legal tea and cheaper than the smuggled in tea. And England thought this would be great. And the colonists really been prepped by some of the writers at the time to be wary of something that is lower but still a tax and not to accept it on principle. And here they stood on that ground, the principle of not being taxed without representation. And we got the Tea Party, the original Tea Party, out of this thing. Sorry. Let me move this Bible off the bottom of the podium so I quit stepping on it. The Boston Tea Party, and at this point, England doesn't back down. All right, before this, we saw things come to a head in England backing down and approaching from a different angle. Here, Parliament and George III kind of buckle down and say they're going to listen. And from that, we get the Intolerable Acts, a series of acts really aimed at just punishing the colonists for what they had been doing, aimed primarily at Boston and at Massachusetts. And then, right at that same time, we have Congress beginning to meet. The Intolerable Acts come in 1774. The first Congress meets in the fall of that year. And all this is a meeting of delegates from the colonists. They get together. They send off a nice letter to the king, trying to lay out things and come to some sort of compromise. Not wanting to declare independence, explicitly not wanting to do that. So they meet in the fall, they agree to come back in the spring if things don't go well, and in between there, something happens. What happens in between these two meetings? Jasmine, that was on purpose, sorry. Joanna? Battles of Lexington and Concord, the first shots officially of the war, April the 19th, 1775. We have that battle taking place, and then very shortly thereafter, less than a month after that, the Second Continental Congress begins to meet, and they still attempt to make peace with the king. They send another petition to the king, trying to get him to make peace with them, to realize what he's doing. And then they become a little more realistic at this point. They send out the petition, and then they start to form an army. All right, they issue a document declaring why they're taking up arms, why do we send this position to the king, and also begin to raise an army, kind of explaining what they're doing. And they pick George Washington to head the army. This is a year before independence. All right, so we're still not there yet. So we have that taking place. That's the spring of 1775. And over the next year, we see the lid blow off this thing. We have Ethan Allen and a bunch of crazies from northern New York. Anybody ever read much about those guys? I read a book a long time ago. Gamaliel Painter was the guy's name, and it was just a biography of somebody that lived in the area, but he rode with Ethan Allen, so he describes this crazy man that led them on these raids and going to burn down a neighbor's barn who was from the other colony, and crazy people. That same group of crazy people went and took the British fort, and they ended up dragging those cannons down to Boston. In Boston, at the same time, we have Washington showing up with his army, a very ragtag group of men, very, very loosely organized, begins to set up defensive perimeters around Boston. That was where the British had already occupied. There was an existing British military unit there. And we have the battle at Bunker Hill taking place in 1775. All right. July 17th, 1775, a year before independence. Right? Then we have a couple laws from Congress, and in the spring of 76, we have those cannons showing up, and we have the British evacuating out of Boston when these cannons showed up. Really, it would have been a suicide mission to stay. They knew that. I mean, it wasn't that they weren't cowards, but they knew they could not hold it, so they back out. Okay, I review all that just to point out that there had already been battles. We already had the British occupying places. We had the British launching offensive attacks into the countryside. And in the midst of all of that, the colonists are still trying to make peace, trying to rectify this thing. They didn't just stand back and let the British keep stabbing them. They did begin to defend themselves, but they were wanting to make peace. They really were forced into this declaration. This wasn't their first choice. There, you can read a few of the extremes early on declaring wanting independence, but they're the exceptions. Most of the time, they're wanting to make peace, and they get backed into this corner here in 1776 of declaring independence, really for their own safety and protection. So, all right, that gets us up to today's lesson, independence. Independence. All right, a little bit of the mechanics of how we get the Declaration of Independence. On June the 7th, 1776, there's a resolution presented in Congress. This would be that Second Continental Congress. They were still meeting. They are the only thing that we have as far as a government until we have the Articles of Confederation written, which wasn't a super improvement. But the Second Continental Congress, they met, and then they stopped, and we had Lexington and Concord. They come back. They're still here. On June the 7th, there's a resolution presented by a man named Richard Henry Lee, and it just declared that the colonies should be free. And here's a partial quote: "These united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states." So we have the resolution, the idea brought up. Following that, there's a committee formed. If you're familiar with how Congresses work, you have to form a committee. I mean, it's like having a gathering at a Baptist church without food and coffee. You have to have it. So there's a committee formed to actually write this thing up. I mean, there needs to be some official declaration of independence, some official statement. So there's a committee formed to do that. There's several men on it, but it's dominated by Thomas Jefferson. He actually writes the thing, and the others make some comments, some adjustments, and it goes back to Congress, and they make some comments and adjustments. But it's basically Thomas Jefferson's work that the others agree to. So this committee meets. They bring back this document to Congress, and Congress votes on July the 4th 1776, to approve this document. And at that point, we have the colonies separate from England, at least on paper. Okay, this had to be won on the field of battle, but at this point, no longer were they trying to make peace with the king. At this point, they are declaring we're a separate country and we're going to defend ourselves. All right, so July the 4th. Hopefully you realize why we celebrate that every year. All right, let me give to you a basic outline of the Declaration, and I'm going to read some bits and pieces of it to you. But I want to first give you the basic structure of the document. I understand if two of you haven't read this thing, but who else? Has anybody read the whole thing? You from Pastor Malinik's? Don't you guys read it, like on the July 4th service or something? Sometimes I just heard stories of Pastor Malinik reading the whole thing at a church service, which I think is not inappropriate. So it's a very good document. I mean, really, if it would be worth your time. I'll let you borrow it and read it. You can Google it. You Google everything else. Google this. All right, let me give you a basic outline. All right, the first point, and the part that, at least as far as political theory and all that is important, is the very first part. And I just have it labeled this way: political theory justifying the separation from England. They start out explaining what government is and why it's formed, and just some basic theory about government. And they use that theory to justify their separation from England. Right? I've got that part broken down into 4 main points that are made. And I'm sure other places you can get it broken down other ways, and those aren't necessarily wrong. This is just my version of how to organize the points that are made. All right, the first point that they make is all men are created equal before God. I think this is part of the reason why liberals hate our founding documents, because they recognize God. I mean, if you're going to claim the Declaration of Independence, then you're acknowledging that we're created by God. It puts a very interesting twist on it. On liberals, they'll claim this is a right declared or given to us by our Constitution and founding documents for 2 guys to be married. But it says these rights, the second point is all men have rights given from God. I'd love for somebody to show us where God gives us the right for 2 guys to get married. It's not there if you're wondering. All right, the first point is all men created equal before God. All right, God created us equal. Not in a sense of intelligence or height or strength or beauty or handsomeness or whatever. If you're a guy, you're handsome. If you're a girl, you're beautiful. If you're a guy, you really don't care. Okay. If you're a guy that cares, then please stop. Please stop caring. All right, but equal before the law. Okay, a good illustration is the way God treats us. We're equal in God's sight. When you go to God for salvation, he doesn't say, oh, your parents were rich, weren't they? So here, you can get saved this way. And someone else, oh, your parents are in jail? Here, you've got to do this. We're not saved differently. We're equal before God. And that same type of equality showing up in our government structure. There's not different ruling classes. If you read even things like the Magna Carta, some of the documents from England, they'll talk about how the nobles are treated, how the clergy are treated, and how the common people are treated. It's 3 different sets of rules. All right, and they're saying no, created equal before God is what they intended. All right, the second point I already stated is that men are given rights from God. They're not granted by the government. When the government, you have the right to live because God gave it to you. It's not that the government is nice and allows you to keep breathing, and it's up to them to take it away. Now, God does give our government authority to take away your life in certain cases. Right? You commit murder, God says you should be executed. Right? But the government should recognize that this is something from God. All right? It's not a benevolent ruler or a nice legislature. These are rights from God. All right, the third thing. We have created equal. We have rights from God. Then we have governments are created to protect those rights. Why do we have a police force? Well, it's to make sure that nobody takes my life. Right? Nobody takes my property. All right, that's why we have a police force. And, well, the fourth point, is that when the government begins to take away these rights, it's time to change something. Okay. When the police just show up at my house and say, "Oh, the city council voted you no longer have a right to life," and they shoot me, then it's time to do something. A little too late at that point. But when the government begins to take away these rights, it's time to do something. All right. The government's created to protect them, protect your right to life, protect your right to liberty, protect your right to the pursuit of happiness. Those three, that's a phrase from the Declaration. That was a very, very common way to just describe generically these rights from God. They fit into those three categories. You might see that pursuit of happiness, some different words used there, but those same three categories show up in lots of places, not just here. But when the government begins to take these away, it's time to do something. Not necessarily get rid of the whole government. All right, it might just be time for the populace to get involved and vote people out of office. But in this case, it had gotten to the point where it was time to throw off the existing government and create another one that would protect these rights. Okay, does that make sense? So, let me read to you the part of the Declaration that gives us this. It's the very first part. This whole first part is that right there, the whole document. Here's the whole document. So just this first two paragraphs, and really the second paragraph gives us the heart of this political theory. And let me read it to you. This is a very, very famous wording here. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. First point. That they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, rights that cannot be separated from you. It'd be like saying, Michael. I was going to call you Matthew. Sorry. No, I was just trying not to insult you and call you Matthew, or insult him. I'm not sure which it is. Your skin, you could argue, is inalienable to you. It's something. It'd be very hard to separate you and your skin. This is something that's part of you. It's something that can't be separated. Unalienable rights, unable to be alienated from you. All right. You might have some cousins that you wish for more alienated from you. Please get away from me. All right. Unalienable. Let me back up. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's the first 2 points there. Created by God, equal, given rights from God. Goes on, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. Pretty straightforward. Deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, all right, these ends were protecting those rights. It is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness, bring about their safety and happiness. Okay, that's about half that paragraph. And right there we really have the political ideology laid out here. The colonists justifying their separation from England. The king had been stripping away the rights that were given to us by God, and it was time to alter or abolish. And in this case, they got to the point where it was time to abolish. He was refusing to alter, so we had to abolish. It goes on to explain how this isn't something they entered into lightly. They realized the risks they're taking, but they had to. The very end of the paragraph says this: to prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. To prove the situation that they're in. They said, let us give you a whole bunch of facts, okay? And that gets us to the second part of the Declaration. We have the first part, political theory, justifying the separation, and the 4 points I just gave you. The second part is a list of injuries and usurpations. That's a quote from the document. A whole list of things that the king and parliament had been doing. And this is the bulk of the document. I know you can't see it, but it starts right there, goes all the way down the page, and goes on this page to right here, so almost half that page. So more than half the document is this list of things that England had done. Let me read some, and you guys tell me what they're referring to. Some of these we should be able to get. He has dissolved representative houses repeatedly for opposing with manly firmness his invasions on the rights of the people. Anybody know of a place where he dissolved a legislative house? New York. Also did something similar in Boston, in Massachusetts. Let's see here. He has made judges dependent on his will alone. What's that referring to?
When the king took over paying for it.
Yeah, king paying them directly. He has erected a multitude of new officers, and I like this phrasing, and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and to eat out their substance. Can anybody think what are they referring to here? What's that? Not that in particular, but it does seem to fit. Underneath Grenville, we talked about trying to enforce all the trade laws that had been ignored, and they sent over just this wave of officials to enforce all those. And we had a similar wave with the Stamp Act, and just over and over all these officials. So erected a multitude of new offices. This could describe Obamacare. And sent hither a swarm of officers to harass her people. All right, he has kept among us in times of peace standing armies without the consent of our legislatures. Where was a standing army kept without their consent? They used the cannons from Fort Ticonderoga. Boston. For protecting them, this is talking about the soldiers and officers from England, protecting them by a mock trial from punishment for any murders which they should commit on the inhabitants of these states. What's that? Yeah, Administration of Justice Act that took the trials back to England. Depriving us in many cases of the benefits of trial by jury. Stamp Act. I read this quote to you earlier. For abolishing the free system of English laws in a neighboring province, establishing therein an arbitrary government, and enlarging its boundaries so as to render it at once an example and fit instrument for the introducing the same absolute rule into these colonies. The Quebec Act. I may not have pointed this out. He has abdicated government here by declaring us out of his protection and waging war against us. The waging war against us, can we think of examples of that prior to this point? Okay. Lexington and Concord, occupying the city of Boston. Declaring us out of his protection. I would have at least mentioned that in passing. I think it's a declaration of rebellion that declared we were in open rebellion and removed British protection from our trading vessels. So it'd be like this governor of Indiana saying, "You crazy Baptists, I'm not going to let the police defend you anymore." What? All right, so abdicating that. All right, he has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burnt our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. Right? Boston, you can talk about multiple things there. How about this one? He is at this time, I might have talked about this, he is at this time transporting large armies. Were they fat? What was he talking about? Okay. Large numbers of foreign mercenaries, and the wording gets good here, to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny. Who's he talking about? The mercenaries. The nasty Germans, yeah. The Hessians, a bunch of Germans most of them from a province of Hesse. The Hessians, bringing them over. What's that?
I think it's
Hessians? It's H-E-S-S.
H-E-S-S-E.
Yeah.
It's German.
Oh, it's German. Who cares?
I've been-
I do enjoy listening to Germans speak. Actually, in Germany, I was listening to them. You have to. It sounds like they're drowning in their own saliva while they talk. This is really guttural. It's just an accurate description. You don't speak German, you speak English. The German, and it's very guttural. I don't know. Even the women are manly sounding. So,
Well, I've been to that.
all right, where are we at here? We didn't talk about this one too much. He has constrained our fellow citizens taken captive on the high seas to bear arms against their country, to become the executioner of their friends and brethren, or to fall themselves by their hands. What practice do the British have, not just in America, but all over?
The press gangs.
Yeah, the press gangs, impressing people into the army. You go down and you happen to be near the docks when a British ship meets soldiers, and you get a beer with a little bit something extra in it, and you wake up on the boat out at sea. And they claim you're a British sailor, and if you resist, then they hang you for treason or something. They kill you. So, forcing them into the Navy. They did that in England, right, to their own citizens, but they also did it here. Let's see here. He has excited domestic insurrections amongst us, and has endeavored to bring our inhabitants, to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages, racist pigs, illegal immigrants or something, whose notable warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. So talking about the Indians, and the British were stirring them up to attack us. So, okay, the point is there's a whole long list of that type of thing, listing out the things that England had done to them. All right, and then the third point. Can anybody think what's left? Yeah, the actual declaration. At the very end, we, therefore the representatives, etc., solemnly publish and declare that these United Colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, etc. They've got to add extra phrases and big words in there to make it sound official. But basically, they say, we're not part of England, go away. What, we quit? No, you guys quit. So, all right, Declaration of Independence. July the 4th, 1776 is when it was approved by Congress. Questions on that? This is a monumental day. We can now really begin American history. There's an America, all right? So we can start. All right, let's talk about some of the battles here. Oh, this is. Do we get halfway through the War for Independence? Just take a nap. That's at least, we gotta, I can't let you out this early. I mean, that would be a crime. I'd be stealing money from you. You would write some document about, like the Declaration. He has eaten out our substance by failing to lecture to the end of the class period. You know, you can make it sound painful. All right, let's begin to look at the War for Independence. We're going to have a significant distraction before we come back. There'll be a war next week, actually. Isn't it a military theme? So we'll have... No, wait. We meet Monday. And Saturday? We're good. We can get this in between now and Monday. What am I thinking? And Jacob wanted to leave. So you both wanted to leave. All right, let's talk about the War for Independence, and I would like to wrap it up by Monday. There's a ton of very interesting and not insignificant things to talk about, but there's also a ton of significant things after the war to talk about. We've got to get to those this semester too. So we will run through the heart of what happens here, and your reading assignment over Christmas is to read at least 1,000 pages of reading about the War for Independence before you show up for class. Okay? Only thought, oh, you can go more than that.
That's serious.
Some of you are thinking, okay, I can Google something and print it in like 400 fonts so you get 3 words per page. I can do that. So I'm kidding. There's no assignment over Christmas. The semester's done. But you are encouraged to do that. There's lots of very good things to read. So read something about Belizean history or something. So. All right, first part of the war, the first section I've got titled 1776 and Trenton and Princeton. We can't just do 1776 because Trenton and Princeton bleed over into January. So for the first bit of the war here, we do have these nice convenient chunks. We've got a series of battles that take place in 1776, and then they take a pause for the wintertime, go into their nice camps and drink coffee, and in the spring resume civilized activities of war. So we do have these nice breaks. The latter half of the war, we have the center of activity moving to the south. So we don't have the winters down there severe enough to really make it difficult to move around. So we don't have the nice breaks in the south. So we see that all run together. But here in the north, we see some independent movements in each year. So, all right, so 1776 and Trenton and Princeton here. All right, I just have 2 main points with some things to flesh in there. The first point is New York. And then the second point in this year is Trenton and Princeton. New York. Should we take a quick vote to decide that if we're happy we won this part? Should we leave it in the hands of the British or something? We got de Blasio and some crazy liberals out of New York. All right, New York, that's the first area of combat here in 1776. Can somebody tell me where's the last place we saw the British military? You said Boston? Okay, leaving Boston. They sell out of Boston. That's this line right here. March 1776. We didn't know exactly where they would show up. Washington guessed New York. It was a pretty logical place for them to attack. So Washington moved his military forces from Boston down to New York and set up defensive things there in New York. And that is where the British showed up. This is the line, July 1776, the British come into New York. All right, so New York. All right, the first point I have is just when I said Washington set up military defenses around New York. He had about 19,000 men, and he built fortifications, sunk some old boats in the harbor to make it tough to sail in and out, just set about trying to defend himself. All right, and the British general's name was Howe, Howe. He shows up in July with about 20,000 men. That's just his land forces. He had a navy that transported them there, but the land force is about 20,000. And he lands on Long Island, the Long Island there by New York. He lands there. And we have the first engagement taking place there on Long Island. Excuse me. Long Island fell to the British on August the 27th. The Battle of Brooklyn Heights is the name of the battle there. It was not especially a close thing. The Washington only had about 1,000 men there. The entirety of Howe's army shows up here, so this is not it was taken. There is this is the first time and one of many times where Washington is able to be defeated but keep his army intact and withdraw from the field and show up another day and fight. All right, here he is able to, they fight the initial day. Washington is pushed back to the edge of the island, and over the night he's able to get his forces off of the island. So when Howe wakes up the next morning to go down and finish wiping them out, they're gone. All right, he wasn't expecting this. Now, God did intervene and provide a really heavy fog so that they couldn't see what was happening. But he's able to get his men off the island. And multiple times Washington does this. he loses everywhere. I mean, it's just, everywhere he goes, he loses, but he's able to keep his forces intact, and that really is the military genius of him. The main battles here, Saratoga and some Yorktown, he does show up and help at, but I mean, he's not at Saratoga at all, right? And we win there. So anyway, this is the first time, and many times, where he's defeated, but is able to keep his forces intact and pull them out to fight another day. So, all right, so we have Long Island taken there August the 27th. Washington pulls his forces back up into New York. He had some fortifications built there, pulls back up into those forts. If you really want details here, he built 2 forts. One was called Fort Washington, one was called Fort Lee. And he pulled his men back to those forts and prepared to defend himself. The British come and attack them and are able to defeat him there. At the heart of the reason for the defeat was the guy who the other fort was named after, General Charles Lee. He directly disobeyed Washington. Right? He eventually gets captured, and Washington doesn't especially care anymore. But anyway, Charles Lee here directly disobeys.
Is he in relation to Robert E. Lee in the Civil War?
It would be fitting, wouldn't it? It wouldn't surprise me, but I really don't know. I don't have anything here about it. It wouldn't surprise me, but I don't know. I know Lee did have family back to here, so it wouldn't surprise me. All right, so anyway, these 2 forts are taken, and Washington is pushed out of New York. And from that point, Washington, here's New York. The Battle of White Plains are outside New York. He gets pushed in this direction, all across New York and then down into New Jersey, just staying ahead of the British. Howe chasing after him, Washington moving ahead. Just pushed all through the summer into the fall, Washington just staying ahead of him, and Washington doing everything he can to make it painful for the British, burning down bridges, gathering all the food as he goes, just doing everything he can to make it difficult, but not able to make a stand, just being pushed and pushed and pushed. Right. Towards the end of the year, December the 8th, Washington, he gets pushed out of Delaware and crosses over into Pennsylvania. So he leaves the entire colony and heads into Pennsylvania. He crossed the Delaware River into Pennsylvania from New Jersey. Anyway, leaves the area, crosses the Delaware River into Pennsylvania. That was December the 8th. Let me read you an excerpt from a British officer's journal describing this time, just to help us appreciate what's happening. The rebels continue flying before our army. Lord Cornwallis, British commander, took the fort opposite Brunworks, plunged into the Raritan River, and seized the town. Mr. Washington had orders from Congress to rally and defend the post, but he sent them word he could not. He was seen retreating with 2 brigades, etc. Just going on. The rebels continue flying before army. That was his description. It's easy to look back and say, yeah, Washington knew what he was doing. No, he was trying to stay away from the British. Right? He did not have the capacity to meet them in open combat, so he kept fleeing. So, all right at this point, there's one other thing I need to mention. Is a man named Nathan Hale gets caught and hung during this escapade. He was an American who was a spy. And he got caught behind British lines and they hung him. He made a famous statement. Joseph? Yeah, I regret that I have but one life to lose for my country. He dressed up like a school teacher and was traveling and got caught with paperwork on him. I'm in the middle of listening to a course, I think it's called Espionage and Covert Operations, the history of espionage and covert operations. So I'm only up to the latter half of the Middle Ages, but it's pretty interesting. So we'll get to this point eventually. He would be one of these covert operators. Yeah.
So he was part of Washington?
Yeah, he's part of Washington's forces, yeah. And he volunteered.
I read a little bit into that book about the Washington 6.
Okay. Yeah. All right, we got to finish this up. So at this point, mid to late December, we have Washington pushed across the river into Pennsylvania. All right, the particular town nearby there is Trenton. All right, and that leads us into the second main point here for this year, Trenton and Princeton. All right, what Washington did here is on Christmas night, he crossed back across the river and attacked the Hessians at Trenton. All right, the Hessians were good Germans celebrating a religious holiday. We want to ask what our good Germans are. Wait, you're the Nazis, not Germans, aren't you? They were drinking. I mean, they were drunk out of their mind. All right, it was Christmas night. They were drinking. Washington knew this, right? So he crosses the river in the middle of the night, shows up. It was not an easy crossing. There was ice and junk in the river. It was an ugly, nasty storm that they're in the middle of. Crosses the river, almost completely surprises the Hessians, captures most of them. There were about 1,500 of them there. 500 managed to escape. One of his units, trying to think of I thought I had the commander. He split up into 3 groups and crossed the river in 3 places. One unit was supposed to go around and prevent these guys from escaping. They thought it was too snowy and didn't complete their task. So he doesn't capture everybody. He would have captured them all. He captured the commander in his house, or not his house, in the house he was staying in. He's got his nightcap on and blurry-eyed, completely by surprise. So captures them here at Trenton. All right, so talk about an amazing turn of events. Washington is just trying to stay away from the British. Now he sees this opportunity, crosses back over, captures them. What happens next? Do the British say, oh, he's beat us, let's go back to New York? What happens next? Monday, we'll finish the story.